Hello, Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, it looks like this year's governor's campaign will not have many candidates. If you like your politics crowded, there's always the presidential race among Democrats. This week, we got an early glimpse. We'll look tonight at the presidential election from a Louisiana perspective, as well as the latest on the governor's race. Crime, as always, was in the news, including a community roundtable about juvenile crime and videos helping the police make their case about a drugstore robbery shooting. 2 jazz funerals this week reminded us of the formative years of rhythm and blues in New Orleans, and this is an historic weekend in the news business as the Times Picayune changes ownership and a new daily newspaper emerges. On the beat for us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate; and Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. We're going to go over to Errol first, and yeah, this is sort of moving into a new phase of newspaper history for the city of New Orleans coming July 1.
Yeah, it's a weekend that's exciting and in some ways kind of sad, especially for those who follow the news business, because what's happening, this is really the last weekend of the ownership of the new houses of the Times Picayune. And so Monday you're going to see this the new newspaper under the Georges. First of all, some people are still confused about what the name's going to be. So just in case you missed it, this is what the flag is going to look like. It's going to be called the New Orleans Advocate, the Times Picayune. Now this is the way newspapers do things. When they combine, they usually kind of combine names for a while. And that's a lot of name for one newspaper.
Well, remember the States item.
Yeah,
Times
yeah.
Media,
Well, at one time that happened that the Picayune had purchased the 2 afternoon papers called the States Item. So for about a year or so, they called it the Times Picayune States Item. After a while, they said, well, enough of this, and they went back to the Times Picayune. I predict the same thing is going to happen here. But the one name that's going to survive is Picayune, because that's the one name that's really unique to New Orleans and New Orleans journalism. One possibility could be the Advocate Picayune over time. But either way, the name Advocate survives too, because they still got the newspaper in Baton Rouge, and so they could just go back to calling that the Advocate and just calling this the Times Picayune. But I know some people, it reminds me of when Rite Aid bought K&B, that some people were sad about losing the name K&B, and if Rite Aid had kept the K&B, right. I think that it would have been much more endearing.
I just have to figure out what I say when I call somebody where I work.
Yeah, that's going to be you can say the paper now.
And
it is the paper. It is,
yes.
It is the newspaper. You know, we had this unusual situation for a few years where we went for fear of having only a part-time newspaper to having a newspaper and a half. The Picayune, which was publishing or distributing 3 times a week, and then the Advocate, which was daily, and so it was a good thing. And there were a lot of journalists who were working, probably more journalists than the economy could afford. Unfortunately, we're losing some of those people, and they were good people, and we knew some of these people, and some of these people were on our show. A newsletter today, the Pointed newsletter, Peter Kovacs, who's the editor of the Advocate, says that there was 25 staffers were made offers, and not all of them necessarily journalists, and we don't know exactly who's who. There are some people we know for sure, because they've told us, Mark Schlefstein, who does the environmental thing. We also know among some of the losses because on today's website, Jeff Duncan, who's on the show a good bit, he was our go-to sports guy, the sports columnist, will not be returning, and neither will Jarvis DeBerry. I've heard actually from you two that Duncan will still be in New Orleans and have a sports-related.
He said in his column
job
today. So,
yeah.
although he left it a mystery.
A sports-related job, but there will be fewer people who are covering. That's a big loss.
We've been spoiled, and it's been. Look at some other cities around the country. Look at some much larger cities and wealthier cities. They've really had their newspapers decimated. This is an industry issue. And we, in some ways, have been really benefited from this newspaper war because there have been a lot of journalists working in town. And, it really is a shame to be losing that.
I do think that some people who, latched on, especially at NOLA.com, Times Picayune, some young people from out of town, knowing this was a fluid situation.
Sure.
probably went in eyes wide open that this
yeah.
was probably
And
not
they
going to be
got to live in New
sustainable in the
Orleans
long
and-
run.
And
You
work in
know?
an excellent news market too. Really
Yeah.
get a lot of good experience.
Exactly.
Certainly, if they're launching, their career elsewhere, great stories, amazing news town, and working for the Times Picayune. That's 180 years
And-
of great journalism
And
history.
in a competitive environment, which you just don't get anywhere anymore.
Very rare these days.
And we're not going to have either now. I'll mention another couple of names. Anne Maloney, the food journalist from NOLA.com, is coming over, so we're really excited about that. David Grunfeld, a fantastic photographer. Bob Warren is going to be an editor. It's going to be good. It's going to be, a reunion in some cases because you mentioned Peter Kovacs, myself, Mike Perlstein. This town is full of people who used to work at the old Picayune who are now at other outlets, many at the Advocate.
Yeah, people may have forgotten that this is actually the second step because
Yeah.
the first started in 2012 when the Picayune shocked everybody by announcing it was going 3 times. A lot of people were let off, and fortunately when the Advocate came into town, they hired some of these people,
Yeah.
yourself included, and
Right.
actually both of your examples of people at one time that worked for the Picayune were able to find employment here. But
Right.
there's
And the editor
not
and the
enough jobs.
publisher are both from the old Picayune, so deep roots here. But it's in some ways it's a little everything old is new again.
Right. I mean, Deep Roots is right. And Times Picayune certainly, in those years before the change, it had just excelled, and its coverage of Katrina was just marvelous. So we are going to miss it. What it was.
Yeah,
the
and what
Times
gets
Picayune that
super
we did
interesting,
know.
and we saw this with the previous contraction 3 days a week happening again, people that you were competing with on Friday, you will be working alongside on Monday. So
I think that period from Katrina and the post-Katrina and the post-Katrina rebuild, where you're right, the Picayune did some excellent work, and there's stories about some of the reporters actually going out and distributing newspapers, and
I was one of them.
Yeah, and Chris Rose really became kind of a big name, and so I think they did a great job. You really needed the Picayune every day for information.
Yep.
But then not too many years after that was the St. Super Bowl season. So that segue from that period,
Right.
which was a very down and depressing season, to the St. Super Bowl season was really just a golden era in terms of news
Yeah.
coverage. It was something that you needed in the newspaper every day.
And I'll say, in terms of the economics, by the time the Saints season came around, and that was also around the time of the BP spill, that's when the industry was, the economic downturn had happened, the industry was really starting to hurt, and that really bolstered us for a few years there. I think what was, the inevitable was maybe delayed a little bit because we had a couple really good years in terms of advertising and sales and things like that, because there was so much news.
Well, July 1, this Monday, comes
Yeah.
the change. So as a web presence, it'll
Yes, NOLA.com.
Okay.
A number of features from the old Picayune will be in the combined paper now, Inside Out, Lanyap, familiar faces, familiar names. Really
for
a
those who are
melding of the two.
for those who are burning to know, I also heard that the weather frog will live on.
Yes,
That's
very excited.
decade plus old.
Absolutely, we-
century old
And the
tradition.
Baton Rouge readers will now meet Weather Frog.
Well, we love our frog. Okay,
Yes.
thanks a lot, guys. Stephanie, we're going to go over to you now. Let's talk politics. You
Yes.
know about that. First off, presidential politics.
Okay. I watched a lot of debating this week.
A lot of debating, and then also ultimately, what does it mean to us here in Louisiana?
Sure. Of course, this was the week of the first Democratic debates, plural, because it was really kind of a debate divided into two pieces because there are so many candidates. And what the Democrats wanted to do, a little throwback to the Bobby Jindal presidential era, they wanted to avoid what happened to people like Bobby Jindal in the Republican primary last time, which was when there were too many candidates, they were divided into the kind of top tier and the bottom tier. The adults table, the kids table. Remember, Bobby Jindal never made it to the adults table. He was always at the kids table. So the Democrats, that becomes a self-fulfilling thing because people, viewers get that, like, these are the serious, I have to pay attention to these, I don't have to pay attention to the rest. So Democrats wanted to avoid that, so what they did is they took candidates who met a pretty minimal set of criteria, polling and fundraising, and divided them up by randomly. So you had the first night where Elizabeth Warren was really the top candidate, Beto O'Rourke, a few others, Amy Klobuchar, and then the second night you had some of the big guns, in addition to Warren, who would be kind of the other top tier candidate. You had Joe Biden, of course, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris had a breakout night, a lot of people thought, Pete Buttigieg. And then, you know, down the ends you had kind of, who is that guy? Who is she?
I was wondering about that. So do they place them in order
Yes.
of fundraising and
If
polling?
you remember last year, Trump was always at the center. That's
Right.
because he was the focal point. Elizabeth Warren was the focal point the first night. Sanders and Biden were really the focal points
Right.
last night.
Until Kamala Harris.
Until Kamala
spoke
Harris
up.
basically
Yeah,
said, look,
she made herself a
and
focal
she,
point.
boy, she had a night. Yeah.
She did.
Now, in terms of content, it was, if you're looking for regional kind of local interest content, there wasn't much. None of these candidates are from here. There was quite a lot of talk about climate change, so that's of course an issue important here,
Sure.
but not really any mention of you know, abortion. We've had, you know, we just had the big fight over abortion in the legislature. One thing that I think was interesting last night was the way race played into the debate. Of course, that was the conversation between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden when, you know, he's the front runner, obviously, but he's been a little bit on the defensive in the Democratic primary. Of course, African American voters are very important to Democrats, and he's got this long history that includes authoring a crime bill that has become very controversial. He made some comments recently where he talked about his ability to work with people who don't agree with him. The people he named were some segregationists, so that rubbed some people the wrong way. That was how this exchange started last night with Kamala Harris, who was the only African American candidate on the stage. And one of the things that's interesting about the Biden campaign is who he signed up to help him on that front, and that is our local Congressman Cedric Richmond, who is, of course, the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and someone who's rising through the ranks in leadership. And he is the national co-chair, which is a very big role for Biden. And one of the things he's done already is kind of gone out and said, he's a good guy. He didn't mean it. You know, he meant this, and I agree with him.
So that's been his
I
job today.
don't know
is
that
doing
was
that.
his assignment, but I think it will kind of work out that way. And if you remember, think back to when Steve Scalise had his big problem a few years ago, when he was, you know, identified as having spoken to a David Duke group. It was Cedric Richmond who said he's not racist, and really gave him a lot of credibility.
So the polls, in terms of Louisiana presidential polls.
The polls, Democrats way too early. There was a recent poll that came out by Vern Kennedy, a pollster who was hired by a group of business people. I should say one of them is John Georges, the owner of the paper, I guess.
The paper with a long name.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting poll because it suggested that perhaps Trump was not as popular as people thought here. And there's been some pushback to it, and I have to say I would take it with a grain of salt. There was no straight, you know, how would you vote if it was Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris or Donald Trump versus Bernie Sanders? But there was a question, there was an approval rating question where he was about even, a little, you know, in the high 40s, approval and disapproval. And there was a question that said, Trump or somebody else, and somebody else did very well. Now, somebody else wasn't identified as Democrat or Republican, so it's debatable.
It's still early.
It's early.
We're just getting really started in
Yes.
that. So, okay, Steph,
Okay.
we got to jump over to Mike now. Juvenile crime continues to be an issue that's concerning the city, or the community, and there was a community roundtable discussion about it.
It's being taken up by roundtables, it's being taken up by the council, it's being taken up by the mayor. And the bottom line is, let's put it all into perspective. It's just crime, except it has the label and the demographic of juveniles. But crime is crime with so many factors that feed into it that there is no quick solution. And what you are hearing from all of these stakeholders who are meeting and discussing is there will not be an easy solution. And what is fascinating is that we have these cross currents, and one person caught in the middle of that is Mayor Cantrell. She, at the time on the council, was kind of at the forefront of juvenile justice reform. She authored an ordinance that eventually carried weight over in juvenile court to stop transferring juveniles over to adult court, even if they're being tried as adults, that thinking that they shouldn't be mingled with adult older prisoners, so they had space at the Youth Study Center. Well, now she's mayor. The Youth Study Center is full. They're turning away juveniles, in some cases arrested in violent crimes, and they need the space. So now she's flipped to the other side, and we have about half a dozen juveniles now being housed at the old OPP, Orleans Justice Center. That's a switch on her part. And it is an interesting dynamic because you see clearly that it's very different being mayor than being a council person. And For example, she now has the police chief, Sean Ferguson, in her ear on a daily basis, something that you don't necessarily get as a council member. And the police are frustrated at arresting the same juveniles over and over, partly because of some reform policies to avoid detention of juveniles. But once again, we've seen juveniles rack up enough arrests to go through the process 10 or more times, return to the street, and police officers waste no time, complaining about that to the mayor. So she's changed her tune on that, and so we've seen the re-implementation of curfew enforcement. It has always been on the books, but dormant for the better part of 12 years. And now, suddenly under Cantrell, that's one of the tools she's using to get a handle on the juvenile crime problem.
And just quickly, with the curfew enforcement, if the police cannot find the guardian or parent, then the child is brought to Covenant House.
Right.
All right.
That hasn't happened, at least in the cases that we've heard about so far. They've all been able to get a hold of a parent or guardian, but the Covenant House is there, and that is a little reform wrinkle. There's not a detention center per se. You don't go to the police headquarters, juvenile office, but you go to the Covenant House where you can hopefully get, presumably some kind of counseling, intervention, and other reform
And also,
measures.
I think that we have to touch on the fact that the juvenile court judges also have become concerned, and that they have changed their policy to actually detain a young person who's deemed a possible risk, detained until they appear before a judge. And that's a change in their policy too.
That is a direct reaction to what's going on the street.
And this is a lot of people kind of coming over to the side of Leon Cannizzaro, it seems.
Well, Leon, who was the one consistent voice,
Yes.
he had been saying, look, some juveniles who we see the docket rack up a dozen or more arrests and climb the ladder of seriousness of crime, that they need to be dealt with much more seriously, and now some people are coming over to his side.
Important issue that we'll have to continue
It's
to have
not going
important
away.
discussions
Crime's
about.
not going away. Juvenile crime's
No,
certainly
unfortunately
not going
not.
away.
Stephanie, you touch now quickly on governors, because we're rapidly running out of time.
Okay, we have a governor's race, and it's kind of going to really start at this point because the legislative session is over. We're getting to how many months? 4 or 5 months to primary day, and there was 3 candidates at this point, 3 main candidates. John Bel Edwards, the Democratic incumbent, 2 Republicans. Eddie Risponi is a very wealthy businessman from Baton Rouge who's written himself a big check. John Bel Edwards, of course, has raised tons of money. Now that the legislature's over, he could raise more. The 3rd candidate, Ralph Abraham, who's the congressman from North Louisiana, Republican, has trailed in fundraising. One thing that happened this week is he signed up a couple of really big heavy hitters in Republican fundraising to help him out. Boise Bollinger and Joe Cannizzaro. Remember, Cannizzaro just had the fundraiser for Trump at his house. So I think the signal is he's going to be competing there. So when you have politicians raising all this money, what happens? Advertising, so expect that. It's just starting now. A group supporting John Bel Edwards, not the campaign itself, has started running television ads on the news. They're very much, the message is he's bipartisan. He passed the teacher pay raise, which has a lot of bipartisan support. It's very much kind of a message that's aimed at those voters who maybe are inclined to vote Republican in a vacuum, but like John Bel Edwards. That's where the fight is going to be.
Any polling done?
Yes, that Vern Kennedy poll that I mentioned before, John Bel Edwards is still way ahead of the 2 Republicans. Again, the advertising could change that. They're not well known, and they're about to start getting their name out there much more.
Let's a quick journalistic question.
Yeah.
The Advocate has traditionally never done political endorsements.
Yes.
The Times Picayune did. Has there been any discussion about that, whether or not it will
I
be?
do not believe so. And remember, we own the Gambit too, which does. That is, as far as I know, not in the plans. Remember, this was all thrown together in 2 months, so it could be that it hasn't come up
But
yet.
in a race like this, that could be a big influence. That could really separate somebody.
Especially now, one owner, multiple papers.
Exactly. One owner who has run for governor himself in the past, I should add.
Absolutely. Okay, Steph, we'll be, we're just starting on that one too, but that's going to come a lot sooner, a lot more intense.
It is.
Okay, Mike, over to you. Technology and solving crimes. A big example of actually seeing a crime being committed was the video that was released today of the CVS robbery. And not today, but this week.
Right, and that was
just amazing.
pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it was.
The technology now with body cameras, body-worn cameras by police officers, crystal clear video.
Crystal clear, yeah.
And in this particular instance, almost textbook that you had 3 officers respond to the scene, each with their own body camera at a different vantage point, plus a security camera inside the CVS drugstore. So you got to see the robbers inside the store with a large garbage bag that ultimately they spill hundreds of pill bottles all over the floor. And then the officers approach in what's pretty textbook, by the book, policy and technique, come in, guns are drawn, get on the ground, but the robbers do not respond to that. They actually respond by bolting to the back of the store and flash their own guns. That's when the officers, and you can see this clearly, they retreat behind some posts, pillars
And you
in
can hear
front
him
of the
say,
store.
"He's got a gun."
And
Yeah.
all of the audio, they do identify that one of the gunmen, that one of the robbers is armed. It turns out both of them were armed. The next thing you see are the robbers bolting out of there, running gun battle ensues.
It's just amazing.
More than 40 rounds fired, at least 29 from the officers, about a dozen or so from the suspects, and it proceeds with an officer wounded, which you can both see from his vantage point, goes to the ground, gets back up, and you also see that perspective from the other officer's cameras as he goes down, gets back up, continues to fire as the suspects try to escape by running across the parking lot. You see each of them get hit, go down, get up and proceed. One didn't make it far, just across the street, and the other hid in a yard for a couple of hours, but they were both captured, treated for their wounds. The officer, thankfully, is fine. Everyone's out of the hospital. But all of that on crystal clear video will play a major role in now the court case to come. These defendants have very little, if no wiggle room to profess any sort of innocence.
So that really does help in crime solving in that way.
Tremendously.
And also, I guess, training, too, as you pointed out, from the different angles. It's just really an incredible
Yeah, and
thing
these
to
are
watch.
used quite extensively in reviewing. There's a whole layer of different reviews by Public Integrity, and the Independent Police Monitor, the FBI, also looks at this. And they do take it to see what could be improved. And in this case, things like, as I said, were pretty much textbook, except perhaps one small factor. Independent Police Monitor raised this, that the officers shooting into the parking lot, where if there had been bystanders or traffic,
It was an early morning.
there was some risk of bystanders possibly getting
I mean,
hit by a stray bullet.
there are a lot of people out walking dogs at
Now,
that hour.
Oh,
That
heavily
fortunately,
traveled, yeah.
this was 6:10 a.m. The traffic was minimal. The
Yeah.
parking lot virtually empty, so they didn't have to deal with that issue. But now in training, they can address, wow, how long do you keep up fire as someone's running away out into a neighborhood or
a neighborhood in that
parking lot of
area
a,
is such
of
a
a major
neighborhood
strip
hub.
mall?
It's just incredible to hear just that gun battle going on right there in that parking lot that so many people frequent, those
Right.
businesses around there.
But let me tell you, this is a great help to police to basically prevent any kind of accusations that their shooting was not a good shooting, that they did something that would have been a violation of policy. It's all there in video, in this case, 3 angles.
Let me get you to quickly touch
Yeah.
on also forensics used to release someone recently.
Well, right, and that was
Had been in
just-
jail for 17 years for a
That's
crime
right, just
that he
yesterday,
allegedly now did commit.
in Jefferson Parish, a man who had been convicted of an armed robbery of a Burger King ultimately was released when some fingerprints taken from the crime scene matched another guy. He was clearly innocent. Both the prosecutor, judge, and of course his attorneys at the Innocence Project New Orleans all signed a joint motion and order for his immediate release. So he rolled out right away. The technology there, they actually had the fingerprints, and it was the computerized database that stores fingerprints from around the country. It's actually a national database called APHIS, in which, at the urging of the Innocence Project, they were able to check the fingerprints yet again, and sure enough, they popped up to another person who is incarcerated in, of course, a string of armed robberies in that same neighborhood of the West Bank around the
So
same
after
time.
17 years, this man is released.
And he was released. These are always poignant scenes, but he had a large, loving family there to greet him, parents, as well as a 17-year-old son who had never known his father as a free man. So it was touching, but encouraging that he came out with a an attitude that was not angry or bitter, and that he had a large support system to embrace him.
Technology making its mark in
That's
crime
right,
solving,
big time.
Okay, Errol, over to you to wrap us up now. Second lines for musicians.
Well, with the this past weekend with the death of Dave Bartholomew, and it was the same weekend as the funerals for Dr. John, and then of course we've seen a lot of these sort of things lately. But it got me to thinking about the talent that came out of New Orleans, and Dave Bartholomew wrote a lot of music for Fats Domino, and if you look at that period in the 50s and 60s. That was really a real golden age in New Orleans, especially for rhythm and blues. And rhythm and blues sort of became like the black alternative to the rock and roll scene, both of which were emerging. And there were stations that were playing rock and roll and that were playing crossover music, and they were really targeting local audiences. There were studios. The most famous was Cosmo Montassa's J&M studio. So you look at that period of time, if you've got talent and if you've got the skill, you're not going to get rich, but you have the possibility of making a record and at least making it big in your locality. And then some of them, like Blueberry Hill, climbed up the national charts. There are probably people in New Orleans tonight who have that same degree of talent, but don't have the same alternatives in terms of making. I'm not quite sure how you make it now. It's done at a national and at an international level. But one bit of proof I was thinking, if you look every year at Mardi Gras, sort of like the timeless Mardi Gras songs that we hear every year, going to the Mardi Gras Mambo, Carnival Time, those were all songs from that period, from the 50s and 60s, performed by performers from that time. And you don't hear Mardi Gras songs from 2012 that came out. And so that kind of shows that sort of lock. And I just hope one day we can kind of open that and let this new creativity flow. Well,
both Dr. John and Dave Bartholomew and then Spencer Boren also passed away in the past couple of years, a couple of weeks rather. Just really have made their mark on the music scene, that's for sure, and the music culture.
It's kind of like an American music, kind of, but real talent.
Real talent. All righty, time to look ahead.
This year is the 50th anniversary of the movie Easy Rider, and there were a lot of scenes in New Orleans. It became a cult classic. And in July 13, there's going to be big celebrations in St. Mary Parish, where some of the scenes were made, but then also in the town of Morganza, where the famous cafe scene was. They tore down the cafe many years ago, but they're going to put up a facade of the cafe so people can come, and people are going to be encouraged to ride their motorbikes through Louisiana to celebrate Easy Rider.
I remember that movie well.
Okay. Back to presidential politics briefly. The Louisiana primary has been pushed back just for next year from early March to early April. It has to do with when Easter falls. It's a little complicated. But in terms of strategy, it used to be that, in March you can get overshadowed by Super Tuesday. In April, everything could be over. But if it's not over, Louisiana could actually be important.
Okay.
And if you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you have to be a registered Democrat. Same with Republicans. Remember that. Right. Plan ahead.
Right.
All right, got to go to one of my pet topics, which is Pelicans in the NBA. Free agency kicks off Sunday. A lot of things in play. The Pelicans have to, finish building their roster, their new makeover. They have a lot of money to spend on free agency. They have a lot of draft picks if they want to get involved in some trades. So it's wide open. Anything could happen.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us. See you next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Good show, y'all.
Yeah.
All right.
Who needed the other person, huh? Is the